Thank you so much for that extremely kind introduction and for organizing to both of you. I hope this is not going to be one of those "are you still watching" alerts coming up on your screen. So I'll try to keep you engaged. So this is very preliminary work together with David, trying to study the evolving content of new work in the 20th century. And just to very briefly touch on that robotic apocalypse scenario again that has sort of raised its head a bunch of times. So the reason why we're not automating ourselves out of work is sort of threefold, and David's already done a great job sort of highlighting the first two reasons, so I'm not going to rehash that, obviously. I'm going to be talking about specifically brand new labor-using tasks emerging, and I'm going to be calling that from now on new work, okay? And you might say, okay, why is that a dimension that we care about? Well, if you think of a world with automation, but no new tasks, then you're really looking at kind of like asymptotic task encroachment, right? Because you're basically thinking of a scenario where an increasing range of those tasks get assigned to machines or algorithms or whatever, and then there's an ever narrowing sort of scope left for humans. So even if the amount of work isn't decreasing, the sort of scope of work would be decreasing. And we really don't think that's realistic, right? So we don't think that's actually what's going on, but surprisingly, there's little empirical evidence to actually look into what then is that new stuff that's emerging. And David likes to call that the dark matter of these frameworks. I like to call it the mystery meat. So, it's whatever you prefer. But what we're trying to do in this project is to actually, then unpack that and see like what's in the sort of new work that we've been seeing. We're planning to do that from 1900 onwards. So we gonna, from now on, have it, from 1940 onwards that we'll be presenting. And we look at, the content of that new work. We form some hypotheses about where we think that new work comes from. We haven't yet tested those, but I'd like to hear your opinion about that. And then also how the content has been changing over time and how that sort of lines up with some aggregate labor market patterns that we already know exist. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip over measurement because I realize I have too many slides, but I will just briefly say, so we use US data. It's representative data, very detailed occupational titles that allow us to detect from one century to the next what has been added, and I'll give you some specific examples in a bit. And then we link that to US Census records. So we have actually representative data for this time period for the US. Okay, that's stuff I'm skipping. First, let me just very broadly tell you what kinds of new work do we actually see in the data. And this is not the sort of most central part of our project at present, but I think it's a useful way to sort of think about what we're seeing and help explain what kind of hypotheses we're developing about where new work is coming from. These are obtained from a very advanced technology I like to call eyeballing. So it's really nothing all that advanced. It's just us looking at what kind of titles do we see emerging and then what kind of things do we think that corresponds to. Okay? Here are the three types we're sort of seeing, and I'll explain them. So the first set of new jobs that we're seeing in our data in all of these decades are what we've termed frontier jobs. And that's pretty much what you would expect, which is as the technology frontier shifts out, so as we develop new technologies, there's people developing those technologies and implementing those technologies. And over many decades, so these are examples of actual titles that we are seeing emerge. I mean, these are just a few. We have thousands. We have things like, automatic welding machine operators in the 40s, airplane designers in the 50s, computer application engineers in the 70s, robotic machine operators in the 90s, artificial intelligence specialists in the 2000s, etc. Okay? And then here on the left, you have actually some recent vacancies that we would class in that kind of category. So what this is really saying is what maybe you would have expected is as automation progresses, as we develop new technologies, that comes with an associated set of jobs that just directly use or implement or maintain or install that technology. It's quite high-tech jobs. Very central to the sort of theoretical frameworks that we have so far also about thinking about how new technology impacts work. So that's maybe not too surprising. But still, interesting to have, the actual content of what these titles are like and how they've changed over time as the frontier of technology has also changed. The second set of jobs that we're seeing are what we're calling last mile work. So this is something that is still related, we think, to those technologies, but it's not all that high tech in the sense that it can be thought of more as sort of the remnant of an almost fully automated process. So you're thinking about something that's almost fully been automated, but there's still some little human input needed, say in the form of sorting bolts or labeling bottles or packing wieners, apparently, or feeding the tamale machines or the vending machines, or the chat room hosts, or what you're seeing here, like the content taggers for Netflix and YouTube. These are not typically, they are, we think, related to technologies, but they're different from these frontier jobs in the sense that they're not necessarily high tech, they're not necessarily directly interacting or developing with these technologies, and they're also not particularly high skilled very often. These are not in any of the sort of existing frameworks that we have as economists for sort of thinking about these jobs per se, but we do see some of them. Not as much as we see for some of these frontier work. Some of them may be performed abroad as well, but that's another category that we're seeing. The third category we're seeing also a lot of that is also absent from the sort of current theoretical thinking on this, is what we've termed wealth work, which is basically just jobs related to providing high-end personal services, luxuries to consumers, okay? Some examples, I will not read them all out, but acrobatic dancer, I'll skip some, tattooer, pageant directors, bowling alley finishers, gift wrappers, fingernail formers, marriage counselors, horse exercises, oyster preparers, golf cart mechanics. These, when you read these, and we have many of these, this is not clearly fitting in the sort of idea of these are not high-tech directly coming from some new oyster preparing technology that's being developed in the 2000s, right? So this is coming, we think, from rising wealth, rising incomes, leading to more demand for these types of services. Okay, so that probably also gives you some idea of how we think about where new work actually comes from, and that's the hypothesis I mentioned that we're currently in the process of rigorously testing, so stay tuned for that. But basically, we're thinking of this as, on the one hand, brand new technology leading directly to new products, new process product innovation, and new specializations from that, so directly. And then on the other hand, just more broadly, demand growth coming, for example, from increasing productivity leading to increasing incomes, right? So it can be indirectly in that sense related. And that's just leading to these increased specializations of these very specific personal services titles. So another example is that we have in the latest inventory of job titles, we have like 100 or so different counselors and like 3 different marital counselors depending on their state of marital breakdown. So it's really extremely, and that type of thing doesn't fit easily in the current frameworks that we have about thinking about how new work emerges as a result of technology. So that's our current sort of thinking on this that we're in the process of testing, but love to hear your thoughts on. Okay. The second set of this sort of preliminary results that I would like to discuss are, thinking about not what kind of work are we seeing, but like how is this changing over time, okay? I'm going to do 3 main sets of results that I hope I have time for. So first, just by broad occupation group, also by skill, and then wage level, and also again split out by skill. So occupation groups, so we were looking at very sort of broadly defined occupations here that we can consistently classify over this whole long historical period. So this is, lowest paid jobs are ranked by their wage. So here you have, some personal services. In the middle, you have production, clerical, admin, sales work. And then the highest paying jobs are your technicians, professionals, and managers. And then what these 2 sets of bars show are, in this case for 1950, the distribution of existing work. So that's the blue bars, they sum to 1. And then these maroon bars are the distribution of newly arriving work across these titles, also sums to 1, between 1940 and 1950. So the blue bars are kind of like the stock, and the red bars are like the flow, okay? So what this is showing you is that there's a lot of new work arriving in these middling occupations between the 1940s and 1950s, even more than there was existing work, right? So a lot of new work opportunities in the middle of this occupational wage distribution. Now we can roll this forward 1 decade, and we keep doing that. We see actually for the next couple of decades very similar patterns. So most of the new work creation here in the middle, it shifts somewhat from production towards more clerical work. It also shifts back a bit, but until 1980, so the whole post-war period up to 1980, we see a very strong new work growth in these middling production administrative titles. And much less in here at the top, like there's much less new work arriving to professionals and managers than there is existing work even, and the same here at the bottom, okay? So we're seeing, if you want, a sort of, if you will, sort of inverse polarization, reverse polarization, whatever you would call it. That starts to change from 1980 onwards. So from 1980s onwards, we see quite dramatically that there's now much more new work here for professionals and much less here for these middling jobs. So there's really a shift from the middle towards the top, also in general, so as a share of total new work, but also compared to existing work shares. Okay, so the flow of new work arriving to these occupations is lower than the stock. And that continues for the next decades. So this is from 1990 to 2000, and then this is the last 15 years, which is perhaps the most extreme still, with really a huge concentration of new work here at the very top, very little in the middle, and also a little bit here at the bottom. And that matches that sort of overall pattern of job polarization that has been documented as well in the overall economy, which we think, tells us not obviously that new work is the only way that work is changing. We don't think that's the case. We think existing work is also changing a lot. But we interpret this new work patterns as kind of like the leading edge of labor demand, or the extensive margin, if you will. So we're thinking that, where new work emerges, also probably existing work is somehow being transformed, and it's where labor demand is going. Okay, that's that overall picture that David showed you earlier. Okay, now this plays out differently for different skill levels, and I won't have the skill by occupation here because I figured I didn't have time, but I do have the overall skill distribution of new and old work, if you will, here, where skill I'm here defining kind of roughly as workers with some college degree or more and workers with a high school degree or less, so college, non-college. And then this is showing you the share of non-college workers in both old work, so existing work for each of these decades, and in new work arriving in this decade from the previous decade. Okay, so the flow and the stock. And what this is showing that over time, the non-college intensity of work has gone down overall. That's not really news. Work has become more skill intensive. The labor force has become more skill intensive as well. But there's been a decoupling of the decline from new and old work from 1980s onward. So until 1980, the non-college intensity of new and old work was kind of declining in tandem, so in step. Whereas here, there's a much more precipitous decline among new work than among old work. So that suggests that there's a sort of a negative labor demand shift against these non-college workers over this period. At least that's how we're interpreting now. So there's, however you turn it, fewer new work opportunities for non-college workers from 1980s onwards than there were before, proportionally to how many non-college workers there actually are in the economy. Okay, now if you're cynical or just an economist, you might say, I really don't care what people do. I just want to know what they get paid. Okay, so I have that too. So here we have their wage level of new and old work, and then I'm going to also split that out by skill. So this is the overall average wage of new and old work for these periods. And here the difference you see is that from 1980 onwards, there's more of a difference in the sense that new work pays more than old work. So, you know, that's in a way good news, right? You could say, great, so on average, we're creating more highly paid, presumably more highly skilled jobs than we were in these past decades. But of course, that doesn't mean it's more highly paid for everyone, right? And the big difference we see there is, again, college, non-college. So just contrasting the first and the last sort of time periods that we have here to save on time. So here I have, for 1950, overall wage quintiles. So, you know, the 20% highest paid, 20% lowest paid, and the middle. And then I have the distribution of new work and old work separately for non-college and college workers across these quintiles. So this is telling you, if we just look at college, so both old and new work for college workers already in 1950 was concentrated in these top two quintiles, right? The fourth and the fifth quintile. For non-college workers, however, it was concentrated in the middle quintile, especially for new work, even more so than old work, right? So there were ample middling paid new work opportunities for non-college workers in 1950. Roll forward to the last 15 years, this has completely bifurcated. So we're now seeing that 50% of college workers that are in new work, 50% of new work for college workers is in the highest quintile, so even more extreme than it was here. But also 50% of the new work for non-college workers is in the lowest quintile rather than in the middle here. So college workers have shifted up, but even more strongly non-college workers have shifted down. And that's a big difference in the sort of locus of new work that we're seeing since 1980 that we think is important to, you know, think about how labor demand has shifted and how the overall job structure is leading to different outcomes for different groups of workers in our economy. Okay. Briefly, I will conclude. So I've told you a little bit of a story about where we think new work comes from, the different new work types that we're seeing, and also presenting you with some first preliminary evidence on the shifting locus of new work, whether we define locus as, you know, occupation or education or skill, or wage, I'm sorry. And also that overall, that shift in the locus has corresponded to what we're seeing in the job structure overall. So after, you know, from the post-war period up to 1980 or so, we're seeing this reverse polarization pattern or anti-polarization pattern, if you will, with a lot of new work opportunities in blue collar and office work. But then from 1980 onwards, which corresponds, of course, to the digital revolution, we're seeing more new work opportunities, especially in high-skilled professional services, and then also a little bit in lower skilled services, especially among non-college workers. And that matches the overall polarization pattern I documented and that David, of course, explained already. So I know you're asking me questions as well, but I actually also have a question for you guys in the sense that, as you know, I'm not the AI expert, but as you know, people who are actually developing and implementing these technologies, I'm very curious to hear how you yourselves think that these sort of activities are contributing to new job creation and also the types of new jobs that are being created in our economy today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you can either ask a question or give an answer. So I have two. I take Michel's and Enrique's question together.
Hi, thank you very much for this great talk. So I don't have the answer to the question, but sort of it's related to, I think, a question that is often asked about, and actually coming to this talk, I thought, well, great, I'm going to learn, what are the occupations I should tell my daughter to actually aspire to. And then I see things like solutions integrator, engineer, something like that. Anyway, these are also all sorts of names where it's kind of difficult to see what are these people actually doing. And I have the impression that relative to the occupations that used to exist, now we have all these titles that I'm not too sure what they actually mean and what people do. And I just wanted to have your view on this, of whether you have the feeling that there's a proliferation of sort of new titles which we're not entirely sure what they entail, what training one should have to actually get these jobs.
Can I respond? Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So what we're planning to do in another part of this project is actually to link these occupational titles to task descriptors, so we can more clearly see what the content is actually of what these titles are, right? Because now we just have the title, which is kind of a bit sparse. If we wanted to do some sort of text analysis on it, is probably not going to be all that informative. So we're trying to, complement this with more those sorts of approaches. We did actually, so both of us also did like a research visit at the census to make sure that what we're capturing is not just spurious, title proliferation. I remember I was in high school, I was picking strawberries, I was the logistics manager, so I think there's some of that, surely. But what they do is basically, and that's what I skipped with the methodology, so they do very actively try to have a full inventory of the work that's being done, because the way where we're getting this is actually these volumes that are used as a coding aid for people who code census entries to census occupations. And what is kind of amazing, that this whole dedicated coding center where people flag titles that they can't classify because it didn't exist yet, and then they review, are they enough of that to populate a new title? So some of those are nonsense titles. So they gave an example, sandwich artists, which turned out to be just something that people at Subway call themselves. So, then they discard it. So they do actually research into, is this really a new title or not? So they don't want to pollute the index too much. We do see some rewordings, like there were some, like all these gendered versions of titles that used to exist that they got rid of. So we discard all of those. So we do our best to eliminate that. But we are pretty confident that there is actual content in these volumes and what they've been adding over time, because that's actually their purpose. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's fascinating research. I found it very, very, very interesting. The question I had goes very much in a similar line to what was said before. My feeling is that in some ways, it may be that some of these new codes that appear, in a way, tell you so much about how the social creation of new occupational codes change over time, historically, as about the real changes in work patterns. And I was thinking, maybe not so much in a US context, I don't know it so well, but for instance in Europe, I do know that generally occupational titles is something that has very strong importance for people's lives, and people actually struggle a lot actively, even within the context of collective bargaining, etc., to identify specific occupational titles in specific ways, and if they are changed, they are normally the object of fights in that respect. So, and this is, so there are a lot of issues around how occupations are named and how occupational titles emerge. And changes in that process over time, and as I was saying, for instance, whether unions are strong or not in the process of discussing occupational titles, for instance, a secular decline in union power, for instance, may reduce the amount of occupational titles just because of that, let's say. And that's what I was wondering, whether something like that is something you had thought about.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and definitely something that we thought about. So that's one reason why we've also, after talking to the census, discarded sort of the approach of looking at the absolute number of new jobs, because they also said, look, some years we have more budget and some years we have less budget, and so we're just looking at the distribution across those titles. So you would have to come up with a reason why there's like a specific push in one title and not in the other. Another, that's also why, some years there may be revisions of the occupational code that may lead to more revisions of titles. So that's certainly something that we've for that reason thought about, but it's a very decentralized process, right? There's not one person that's get lobbied by all these organizations to add new things. These are individual coders that spend their entire working lives. Actually, we learned these are not like ad hoc people. They do this entire working lives coding census forms to occupations. These are the people who literally write on Post-its, I see this title, I've never seen it before. So this is very decentralized. So you know, I'm not sure how you lobby these people. So it's sort of one person's initiative to say, let's revise it. So some other initiatives like the ONET have this, right? They have this sort of list of things that they say are hot or new, but those are typically quite decided by a committee, and you know, so this is a very different process, and that's kind of one of the strengths, actually, we think of these data. Of course, there are drawbacks, like you know, we worry about some measurement error things, but we're pretty confident that this is not some sort of general title proliferation that's the result of lobbying for certain classifications. Yeah.
Thank you. So next question we have here.
Yeah, no, it's pretty quick, and I would have to agree. Some of the titles, I saw a wiener packer.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah, I didn't know such a job existed.
It's very detailed, right?
Yeah.
There's like 30,000 titles per decade. So it's not just like packaging worker. It's specifically what do they pack.
For a wiener.
That's the level of detail. Yeah, for a wiener.
No, my question had to do with the changes in the skill of the occupation itself over time. I know you're interested in, because you didn't go through the measurement, I know it seemed you're more interested in the new occupations, but I wanted to have an idea about some occupations that perhaps have remained, but perhaps the skill level of those specific occupations have changed over time, and there you go.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. So the reason, so we're this level of aggregation, it doesn't matter whether you take the ranking in 1940 or in 2015, they're the same. So we're very confident that this is an informative ranking at this level. If you want to look at very detailed, you know, we have census occupations about 300 or so per year, right? So per census volume. There you could argue that maybe there's some leapfrogging, but generally, you know, it's not the case that suddenly personal services are becoming a lot more skilled than they were. What I think is kind of also part of your question, which we are trying to address, is, sorry?
Or less skilled.
Yeah, okay, but you know, in the ranking, it seems to me to be pretty invariant. So I'm not expecting that personal servers are suddenly above technicians, for example, right? But I think what your point is also getting to, which was very interesting, are these sort of within occupational transformations, right? That our work doesn't directly inform on. So we're thinking of this, as I said, as a leading edge. We think it's like, you could see like the canary in the coal mine or something like that. But what we're doing also with complete count census, so that's from 1940 backwards, and we're now also talking to census to give that to us from 2000 onwards, is to actually link individual census entries to these new titles. And then we'd be able to compare people who are in the new titles but in the same occupation versus old titles in the same occupation and see how they do differently, whether they, you know, there's some degrading of those old titles in terms of, say, skill, the level of skill of the people who enter compared to the new ones. So I think those questions are super important. We can't at present address directly, but we will in a separate part of the project. But I think the overall sort of distributional picture that I'm showing here is actually invariant to that, you know, within occupational pattern, just because these rankings of these broad occupations are very stable over time.
And the skill level of the occupation is determined by the skill level of the individual, or what you need to do.
Of the individual.
Of the individual.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, those are very good points. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're working on addressing that.
Okay.
Another Netflix show.
Are there any other questions or answers? Yes, please.
No answer, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But I was wondering, so you have you identified the three different types of new work.
Yep.
By eyeballing, okay. But so I was wondering, like, how persistent are the different types? If I want to know what's the future of work,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
which ones, do they differ in their persistence, or?
Yeah, we use this, so this is our main analysis. So we just use the occupations that are classified. So we started out by just to sort of get some handle on the data, because it's a lot of data, and you know, it's not very easy to do some sort of natural language processing on these titles, because, you know, don't have like full description, just the title, right? So this is not currently in our project, but I thought for this kind of audience not to resort to like the econ speak of the models that we developed for this, I thought it was a good way to present it. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but you're an economist, so that's probably why. But yeah, no, but so the sort of reason why we started thinking along these lines is because the current theoretical frameworks are mostly focused on these frontier jobs. So they kind of ignore these other categories that we see a lot of, especially wealth work. So just going through these titles, we're thinking, well, this is kind of a puzzle. You know, how should we think about this? How many are there? So we started to kind of compile them. But, you know, the main way that we're thinking about how has sort of the locus of new work change is just by using the occupational code, by using the skill content, by using the wages that they pay. So this is more like a kind of descriptive side-on analysis that we do want to further formalize by looking at the task descriptions and then classifying those more sort of comprehensively, rather than just based on the title and us eyeballing it, as I called it. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just think even though it's just eyeballing, I think it would be really interesting to see, for example, does this last mile work only last for like 10 years?
Yeah,
or,
yeah.
like,
That's
does
on
it
our,
stay?
Exactly, yeah. Well, we have a plan to look at this. You can look at the vintages of these work accumulated across different years, and you would also think that the frontier shifts, right? So what was frontier in 1950 is no longer frontier in 1970. So the wage premium for that, if there's one, right, that we're looking into, would then tend to decay over time, presumably. And yeah, last mile work you would expect to disappear. And actually, we did do that. So if you accumulate titles, we did this only from 1970 onwards, I believe, accumulate titles over time, last mile work as a share stays kind of constant, which is consistent with, we keep adding in new titles, but the other ones dwindle in terms of employment. What we can't do, which we did plan to do, we can't, is also look at dead titles. So we could also say, hey, let's take the same approach and also see what titles are removed from this index and say, hey, those are dead jobs. But actually census doesn't really remove stuff because they say, well, it's in there, it's why would we, if there's only even 5 people doing it, it's handy for our coders to still have that title. So they don't really actively remove stuff. They only actively add. But yeah, we do see that. So yeah, that's a good point.
I think this is very compelling, and it makes me think of Enrico Moretti's book, The New Geography of Jobs, where he says San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, Boston, you see lots of frontier jobs, so software engineers, life sciences, designers, and wealth work.
Yeah.
Like the first produce new products and services that are being exported, and the second are yoga teachers, Pilates, and so on, who thrive thanks to the extra wealth coming into the area.
Yeah,
so in that sense,
that's actually one of the ways we want to test the hypothesis that increasing demand leads to the proliferation of new titles is by looking at spatial concentrations of wealth and see does that then correlate with more of this new work being added in those places compared to other places where there's not so much of that concentration. Yeah.
Psychologists typically, no, in wealth work. Yes.
Yeah, we have so many counselor titles. It's crazy, yeah.
Other questions or also answers to the question she asked? We have time for one more. No? So your question won't be answered?
Well, that's fine. It was more there in case no one had any questions for me, like a backup plan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.